Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell attends a meeting of the International Monetary and Financial Committee in Washington, D.C., on October 14. Powell announced another rate hike on Wednesday. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell attends a meeting of the International Monetary and Financial Committee in Washington, D.C., on October 14. Powell announced another rate hike on Wednesday. The Federal Reserve ordered another big rate hike on Wednesday, warning that rates will need to rise further to bring stubbornly high inflation under control. The central bank increased its key interest rate by 0.75 percentage points. The rate, which was near zero in March, has risen 3.75 percentage points over the past 8 months. This is the most aggressive series of rate hikes in decades, but so far it has done little to contain inflation. Interest rates have risen at a whiplash-inducing speed, and we're not done yet, said Greg McBride, Bankrate's chief financial analyst. It's going to take some time for inflation to come down from these lofty levels, even once we do start to see some improvement. Annual inflation was 6.2% in September, according to the Fed's preferred measure, unchanged from the previous month. The better-known Consumer Price Index shows prices rising even faster, at an annual rate of 8.2%. Fed Chair Jerome Powell warned that taming such high inflation would likely require even higher interest rates than he and his colleagues forecast just 2 months ago. "What I'm trying to do is make sure our message is clear," Powell told reporters Wednesday. "We have some ground to cover with interest rates before we get to that level that we think is sufficiently restrictive." At the same time, Powell said the pace of rate hikes could soon slow as policymakers take stock of the impact higher borrowing costs are having on the economy. "That time is coming, and it may come as soon as the next meeting or the one after that," Powell said. Stocks initially rallied on hints of minor rate hikes in December or January. But soon the prospect that interest rates would eventually have to rise faded. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 500 points, or 1.55%. The broader S&P 500 index fell 2.5%. McBride argues that borrowing costs will likely need to remain elevated for an extended period to contain inflation. "The mantra for 2023 is, higher for longer," he said. "When inflation's been running at 6, 7, 8% and the target is 2%, it's going to take a while." Rate hikes are having an effect, even if inflation remains untamed. Higher borrowing costs have already made a big dent in the housing market. And other parts of the economy are beginning to slow down. But consumers, still awash with cash saved up when the pandemic began, are continuing to spend. As a result, the Fed may have to slam on the brakes for longer than it otherwise would. "We see today that there is a bit of a savings buffer still sitting for households, that may allow them to continue to spend in a way that keeps demand strong," said Esther George, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. "That suggests we may have to keep at this for a while." Like her peers on the Fed's rate-setting committee, George has expressed his determination to control inflation. But she also warns against raising interest rates too quickly in times of economic uncertainty. "I have been in the camp of steadier and slower rate increases, to begin to see how those effects from a lag will unfold," George said last month. "My concern being that a succession of very supersized rate hikes might cause you to oversteer and not be able to see those turning points." As polls show inflation is a top concern for voters, the Biden administration and most congressmen have stayed out of the way of the Fed in their bid to control prices. But a handful of Democrats have begun to question the central bank's approach, warning that aggressive rate hikes could put millions of people out of work. We are deeply concerned that your interest rate hikes risk slowing the economy to a crawl while failing to slow rising prices that continue to harm families, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat Massachusetts, and colleagues wrote Monday in a letter to Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The housing market has already slowed to a crawl as mortgage rates are above 7% for the first time in 2 decades. Kansas City homebuilder Sean Woods said his company sold from a dozen homes to fewer than 5 a month before the Fed began raising rates. Never in my wildest dreams would I have thought we'd go from 3% mortgage rates to 7% within 6 months, said Woods, president of Ashler Homes and the Home Builders Association of Kansas City. I think we're in for a rough 6 or 8 months, Woods said. Typically, housing leads us into downturns and it leads us out of downturns. And I think from a housing perspective, we've probably been in a housing recession since March or April. Despite the fallout from rising interest rates, Powell said the central bank has a responsibility to bring inflation under control. No one knows whether there's going to be a recession or not, and if so, how bad that recession would be, Powell said. Our job is to restore price stability so that we can have a strong labor market that benefits all, over time.